Welcome to the third episode of The People Business. I am one of your co-hosts, Orchid Bertelson, Chief Operating Officer at Common Thread Collective, and I am joined by my effervescent co-host, Dane.
First time ever called effervescent in my life. Amazing. Thank
I
you.
know there's a first time for everything. Well, it's nice to see you, Dane. I see
Oh,
you multiple times a day, but first time this week in a recording studio.
it's fantastic. And I am starting to really enjoy these conversations with you, Orchid, because it kind of gives us a chance to get above the fray and not be putting out a fire, but talking about fires that we put out and the rest of it. So it's really, I'm loving this new habit. And it's been fun to hear from listeners too, who've expressed a sense of, you know, peeking into our world at CTC that often is known for its practices
Math.
and right, math, finance, like all the things. And really like it's just a lot of data work and learning how to press the buttons better to get a better impact for brands. But I this is a human services business. So inevitably talking about humans and making this space human, I think for some listeners have been refreshing and kind of giving an accurate insight into how we actually navigate these waters.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to change things up because it's the third episode. So why don't we do things a little differently? So usually Dane asks wonderful questions and I try to answer them to the best of my ability. Today we're going to kind of turn the tables a bit and I am going to interview you, Dane, because of your wealth of experience in, I think, helping humans achieve whatever it is that they want.
Mm,
And I think that that means pushing them past the sense of discomfort
mhm,
and into really embracing it
mm,
because it signifies change.
mhm,
And you've built your career on this. And I think that it's been really interesting for me to experience your thought leadership and coaching lens
mm,
into really making sure that the impact is felt at every level of an organization and actually seeing the change as it pertains to business.
mm. Yeah, the work with it, it's funny. So much of the work that I feel so privileged to do in CTC is deeply connected to my own pursuit in my own life of wanting to find work where I could personally contribute in a way that was meaningful, significant. But I also had a sense of I wasn't just grinding. I'm engaging in a way where there's an intent. I'm kind of aware of why I'm doing what I'm doing. And there's some methodology to it that can be used in multiple contexts. And the more I've done it on a personal level, the more I've had a chance to be engaging with really well-intentioned people who, if they could just tweak a little, they could take what is already hard work and make it smart work. And all of a sudden they have a very different experience in the workplace. And it's so gratifying when that happens for the folks we get to work with.
And I think what's really great about our time together here is that we get to talk about humans at an individual level, but really about the collective, right?
That's right.
Like
That's right.
what happens when you come together and there's exponential growth and there's exponential impact. And so there is a quote that really inspired the topic for today. It's attributed as like an African proverb, but then it has since been debunked. And so it's just a quote that's out there on the internet. But it says, if you want to go fast, go it alone. If you want to go far, do it together.
Mm. Yeah.
And I think that in our org, we've certainly seen this where it does take time and intention in order to get everyone kind of moving in the same direction. And so, what is your initial sense of that quote? I will say
Mm.
that I used to be the first, and I realized that I should probably be the second.
No, I think alignment with a collective group of people is one of the hardest things to accomplish in an org, especially if you are gathering the kinds of people that are ambitious, are smart, are skilled, are getting traction on their own. They tend to profile like the kids in college that they'd get into a group project and they did the heavy lift. You know, they kind of put up with the folks that were hanging around, but that's right. And you end up, everyone else gets an A on your shoulders, and that's great. I love attracting those kinds of people, but it would be entirely naive to think that you can bring all of these people who know how to be individually strong to become collectively strong, because that requires a different way of relating. You see all this all the time in professional sports, for example, where you have these elite athletes who come together in some of these super teams in every different sport you can imagine. And one of the hardest jobs of the coach or manager is to figure out, how do you get these people to play together? How do you play well? And do it in a way where there's a kind of a rule book or a sense of identity around who we are as a group and what are we trying to accomplish together, and how are we putting ourselves on the hook to go and execute in that way. And I love that metaphor. I know that's limited for some folks if they don't appreciate sport as well as some of us do at CTC, but it's a very resourceful way to look at it. And I know it's funny, you're wearing a Detroit Tigers hat and you're a big fan of the Lions, and I think the Lions this year is a great example of, they finally started putting things together, and it was because they had tremendous buy-in from the top down to the bottom. And
And they were
uh,
really terrible for a long time, so their
forever,
draft picks were pretty
forever.
pretty good.
Well, and that's the other side of the equation, Orchid, is you can actually, if you can figure out the collective thing right, you can actually take folks that aren't elite, that aren't top of the game, that aren't just a bunch of egos, but actually are kind of regular folks. But when they get in alignment and know their part, know their role, are wholehearted in their contribution, that that kind of collective can do far more than a bunch of individuals who are super talented. But it's just uncommon because a lot of the work that has to happen is interpersonal, it's conversational. And getting agreement, trusting, relaxing on the stories we make up about each other, getting really clear on what we're trying to accomplish and how we're actually going to execute on that, and trusting the people above us, below us, adjacent. There's a lot of dynamics that are going on in the midst of, especially in this cultural moment, where you know many organizations are dispersed all over the world. You have, time zones and cultural differences and experiences that are very different from each other. And even just, you walk off of a Zoom call into your real life. I'm in the process. We just sold our home. We're moving to Southern California, and I'm staring at a room full of boxes. And, people don't know that on a Zoom call. It just, but it's a reality of pressure that I'm experiencing. So if you're going to kind of harness a collective, you need to account for all of the variables that are contributing to stress, personality, experience in life, what the people are in the midst of right now, mental health, and finding a clear way to have a conversation where you're getting the right variables on the table and finding agreement for what we're going to do together.
I would say too, I do feel this tension in culture of course there's a big rallying cry about, teamwork, right? We all watch Kansas City win the Super Bowl or maybe the Taylor Swift Bowl, however you want to brand it. But, I do think yes, there's very obvious like yes, building a strong team. Phil Jackson wrote a book really about cultivating that team. And then I think on the other end of the spectrum, which is actually very driven by e-commerce and tech and entrepreneurship, is this the founder or a solopreneur
Mm,
as the hero.
mm,
And you see this time and again with Meta. I think that Sheryl Sandberg is probably the most famous COO to have ever existed, but usually they take a backseat role. You
mhm,
have Elon Musk, who is the head and the CEO of these successful businesses, but you've also got COO Gwynne Shotwell calling the shots at SpaceX.
mhm.
And so I do think that culturally there is this attractiveness to say, oh, like Mark Zuckerberg did it himself.
Right.
Right. And then so I feel that tension. And I think that for a lot of folks early on in their career, like those are the stories that they've been told. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's very attractive. So all of a sudden, and we attract people with entrepreneurial spirit, full stop. Right. You either are one or you have that characteristic.
Mhm.
And so you take these people who want to have this like ruthless curiosity about things and wanting to gain the momentum. And then all of a sudden we're saying, hey, you have to bring these other folks along. So
Yeah.
how do you think about that tension?
Well, I, the tension is entirely the right word. You can have stress that is toxic. We don't want that kind of an environment, but we want just enough tension to get people to feel a little bit uncomfortable, kind of at all times. You make fun of me all the time because I I'm an endurance athlete and I do a lot of running distances. And it's interesting. Most of the training to do really long distance running requires what's called zone two training, which is basically getting your heart rate. You're trying to figure out a way to go faster, but your heart rate is at a lower pace. So you're to train for that, you log 80 to 90% of your training is running really slow, like steady, consistent. Actually trying to find a way to be just a little out of breath, like, so you can have a conversation with somebody that you're running with, but you're not gonna die. And if you can kinda get to that place and do that consistently over time, what happens is you end up being able to go a lot faster than normal, but you're doing it at a sustainable pace because your heart isn't gonna blow up after, 20 miles. So
That
this
sounds bad. I'm not a doctor, but that does sound
heart
bad.
blowing up, it really bad, and metaphor for a lot of entrepreneurial outfits out there, and because they start cranking, and their people start dying, and they haven't figured out a way to move forward. And beyond the metaphors that we're describing, I think today's gonna be very helpful to get to some really just like what actually happens transactionally in a conversation between 2 people in an organization, such that both people become more wholehearted in their effort to contribute in a sustainable long-term way. I think this kind of granular conversation is one that it's not very sexy compared to, reading headlines and, the basically, Twitter or X soap operas that we watch,
TikTok.
TikTok. We just tune into stuff and it seems like we think that's the point. That's where it all happens. But all of that stuff, whether it's a nightmare happening in front of us that we watch with our popcorn, or it's some other kind of uber success story, all of those things are just downstream results of basic building block agreements that happen way before that's the case. And if we can figure out ways to make better agreements between individuals, then what happens is you add enough of those agreements together in the context of a group, a collective, you can create a tremendous sense of power. You can actually output as a group far more than you could as a series of individuals, going back to the proverb you mentioned at the top of the show. And I'm hopeful that today's conversation will give a little peek into what we do at CTC actively and talk a little bit about the challenges that come with these kinds of conversations. But ultimately for folks listening in, that they can actually take these ideas and start experimenting themselves and see if they don't find the fruit that we're starting to see at CTC.
So you've talked about agreements, we've talked about individuals versus teams. And so at the end of the day, what we really want to get clarity on is how do you move forward as an organization? Like what needs to be true?
Yeah.
So in your opinion, like if we let's say we want to go far, right? And we
Yeah.
want to do it together, like what is the most important thing to achieve that?
Yeah, so I'd love to look at it in a couple different ways. So if you think of like a y-axis, I think it's helpful to have a clear sense of, mission and values and goals and what does the company need to do to be successful and for there to be kind of an organizational declaration, usually from leadership, of we will be successful if this happens. And this has to be measurable, specific, concrete, like tangible. And everyone has to see it and be clear about it and hear it like 10,000 times that we say that this is the end zone. This is success. This is a promised land. But I think when you get beyond that plane, that gets worked out largely one to one, meaning if I am a manager of an individual contributor or at any place in the org chart, it could also be laterally. It could be me with another VP, or it could be me with you and my boss, or skip step, or whatever it is. It's any two individuals that are getting together. I think the building blocks to execute on the big goal, whether you're measuring that with OKRs or KPIs or goals or whatever it is, we need to set that aside on some level and sit down one to one and say, okay, well, what does it mean for you and I to have a working relationship where you can trust what I'm doing and I can trust what you're doing with our incentives aligned and us moving forward methodically. I believe it starts with one, it could be anyone, by the way. It doesn't have to be the boss or the manager. Most of the time it is, but it would be me going to a colleague and saying overtly, I want to make an agreement with you. It's actually not too dissimilar from if a salesperson in BD or Rev going out into the marketplace and saying, hey, I'd like to make an agreement with you. You're a customer. We're a service provider. We're going to make a difference for your business, and your business is going to make a difference for us. We're going to align our values. We're going to get really clear in the process, how we communicate all the things. And that same kind of process can be broken down individually in conversations with the folks we get to work with. What we have found at CTC is that when we do these step by step, there's a really interesting dynamic where it invites less of a handed down goal, go do it, and more of a collaborative sense of like, no, no, I have to show up a certain kind of way, and you're going to commit to show up a certain kind of way to me, such that we together are going to create more value than we could individually. And I think that's the part that we want to dig into with it. But it begins with somebody saying to the other, I want to make an agreement in a conversation and being overt in that declaration. Does that make
So I
sense?
think that's yeah, and I think it's so fascinating because I think it's pretty novel in a way, and
Yeah.
I'll explain why.
Say more.
Um, so my first job was I graduated in college in 2005.
Mm.
I am very much an exennial, an elder millennial, millennial, whatever you want the title to be. And the idea that you could have a conversation with your boss about what success looks like, very foreign.
Hmm.
Because I think historically it was that, hey, the boss says I should do this. And if I do this, I will be successful. Cool. I'm going to go do the thing. Maybe it's just me, but but I do feel like there's an entire generation of folks who are now in leadership and management positions who that was our experience.
Yeah.
Was that goals were handed down and we just did what we were told, right? And I think what's interesting about what you're saying now is to say, hey, of course the goals will be like the definition of success that will be defined by the CEO or maybe the leadership team.
Mhm.
And I think that what's interesting is that now when I have conversations with my direct reports, it's that, hey, we agree that this is success. Now, how do we think we should get there?
Yes.
I think that for you leading paid media, that means delivering X amount of new client revenue, retaining Y amount of client revenue. What do you think? What do you think are the drivers to your team, your area of responsibility into achieving the organizational goal?
You know, first of all, the framing of it again as a conversation is so critical here. Aristotle said that to have a good conversation, you need three dynamics. One, you need intelligence. So those two people need to be thoughtful and understanding of what you're talking about. Two, they need to have goodwill. You need to trust that when you're saying that and you're asking their opinion, you actually mean it in the request. Like they have insight. You trust them. You respect them. You're inviting that out. And third, that there's candor, that people aren't kind of holding their cards too close to the chest. They're actually getting things on the table so we can be clear on what are we working with here and can we move forward? Any one of those three pieces, goodwill, candor, or intelligence, if that's not there, it's like a leg on a three-legged stool. The conversation falls over. So there is some kind of basic fundamental assumptions that we're making, even in talking about making an agreement. And I think if folks are listening, that would be a good place to just double check. Do we have a culture where people are candid? Do we have a culture where we have smart people giving and being invited to give good input? And are people actually sharing? Or are they scared? Are they kind of quiet hiding? And because they're nervous to raise their hand because maybe they were trained in a school that if you raise your hand, you get in trouble. So I think that's just a first nod to exactly what you're describing. But I think from there, it also points to this need for co-creation. Like if you're going to make an agreement, it really requires at least two people to participate. So asking questions like if you were saying that to someone, you're like, this is where we want to go, and you got everything on the table, for you to say, does this work for you? Like, it's not just what do you think? It's like, can you see this as a workable solution? And do you see, is there anything missing? And by the way, we don't just want mental assent or for you to say the right words. Is this showing up tangibly in your calendar? Like where you're actually going to execute on this in a way that we can all have eyes on it and say, yeah, that work is being done. So all of these kinds of workability questions, that's really a reflection of co-creating and full participation if you're going to make an agreement actually work. Both parties must see a path to keeping the agreement. If indeed somebody doesn't really believe in it or doesn't see it, it just, again, it breaks. And It's why this isn't for the faint of heart. You're having really specific, direct conversations about what do people have faith that we can move forward with this, or don't they?
I will say too, like, this isn't about negotiating to the mean. So, what I mean by that, and I'll use a specific example, if your goal is 20% EBITDA, and I'm going to one of my direct reports and saying, hey, you need to deliver 20% EBITDA for your business unit. It's not about having a conversation where that person goes, well, what about 15? It's like, sorry, it's not 15. It's 20.
It's 20.
And
That's
so,
what
but I think what it is about is, all right, what do you think 20% is achievable with what you have right now? If the answer is no, then let's talk about, okay, in order to achieve 20%, what needs to be true,
yes.
right? Do you
Oh,
need more people? Do you need more budget? Do you need me to remove barriers? Do you need executive support? Like, because the goal is the goal. I think we're more having a conversation about what needs to happen for us to achieve the goal.
I'm so glad you said that, and I love the way you framed it. Like, there's it's not just about what are you gonna go do. It also includes what resources do you have or don't have, but it also includes, and I think this is the most critical part, do people see themselves being willing to be at stake for the thing, for them to show up differently? Like, it could be that you're going into a season where, like, 20 sounds like a really big number, and it's gonna require a lot more of me to go execute on this. We were in a conversation like this, making an agreement with one of our new growth strategists and his director, and I was facilitating the conversation, and it was interesting on the heels of getting real excited agreement. This employee is just like a rock star. We see him just going to the moon. And the ending part of the conversation was a recognition that where we're going is a leap. It's a big jump. So we actually took pause in the conversation and said, okay, so if we're going to really go for it at this level, who do you need to be in order to execute in that thing? And maybe how does your life need to adjust? Like, do you have things going on in your personal life that are gonna come in conflict, that's gonna create tension and stress? Is there any things that need to be removed in your world, at least for a season, so that we can go and hit where we wanna go? Is this actually the time where you can show up in this way? And it was interesting to hear the employee respond with a sense of like, "Oh my gosh," like, almost like, "Oh, you're serious? Like, you're not just saying I'm gonna add, add, add. You're saying if I actually wanna become excellent in a new skill set and hit that kind of a number, I'm gonna have to really orient my world to that." And that's exactly what we were saying. And what was fascinating to me was he didn't come out of that conversation discouraged. He actually came out galvanized. Like, "Oh, you believe in me. Like, you see me being able to get there. You're taking this seriously. You've done this before." This is the director in the conversation. And it's one of those moments where, like, I just get kind of the tingles of like, oh, like we're literally watching people show up into a conversation where your own confidence in their future ability to deliver is increasing. When I am in those conversations, it's one of the most gratifying experiences I've ever had as a professional, because you're literally watching people choose to grow, choose to make their life more difficult in the short term in order to become the people that they've been craving to become in their careers.
What I'll also say too is this idea of like continuing to add without taking things off of someone's plate.
Mm,
I do think that if I was aware of this conversation and this way of being when, to my younger self,
yeah.
I don't think it would have been like, oh, well, what needs to come off my plate because you're adding all these new things. It would have been like, hey, the goal that we agreed on for me, the things that you're adding, either they contribute to the goal and I will do them, but then we kind of have to reorganize like what doesn't contribute to the goal because
Mhm.
then, I either need to be goaled differently or we need to rethink about what it is because there are bad managers out there, right?
Yeah.
Or green managers or unseasoned managers. And so you do, I think, in moments of stress, I've experienced this too, where you're like, oh, you need to do that. Oh, and also that, and also that.
Mm,
And at a certain point, maybe it's because the goal changed and that's why you're adding the different things.
mm.
Or maybe it's just like, kind of in the back of my mind in the parking lot of ideas. And I'm like, okay, you should go do that. And so it feels like it's a much more productive conversation of saying, instead of, when someone adds something, it's like, oh, okay, like what needs to come off my plate in order to do that new task.
Mm.
I think it would be more productive to say, okay, well, this is my goal for this quarter. These things that I'm doing, I've prioritized because in my mind, they help me achieve that goal. This new thing that you're adding, how do you envision that
Yeah.
contributing to the goal? Like, is this in lieu of something? Is it that if I don't add this, I can't get to the goal with like the current things that I'm doing? Like, I think that's more of a productive conversation.
Yeah, bingo. I couldn't agree more. And it gets again, it continually gets more granular. Like as you start and engaging and people are starting to ask those questions, those are the appropriate questions for people to ask. If I'm saying, hey, I'd like to make an agreement with you, and you say, well, what about, does that mean I'm not going to do this? I'm going to do that. What will this do to get to the goal? All of these things are illuminating current reality, what someone is already on their plate. And sometimes we're naive to all that's there. And I think it's important to get that stuff articulated, as well as, and in a sense, it's like you're kind of defining what success is, not just for me handing down the the thing that we need to hit, but for them. Like, why do they want to show up at their work differently? Why would they want to get into an agreement where they're this at stake? And in that effort, defining like little things like how are we going to communicate in this next season to make this agreement whole? What will be impacted when the agreement is successful? How will this tangibly contribute to the North Star that we're both shooting for? What are the consequences if I break my agreement to you? And what are the consequences if you break your agreement to me? Let's get that on the table on the front end of the agreement. We do this when we buy and sell cars, houses, deals. Like this happens all the time. Why wouldn't we do it interpersonally? Well, mainly because we can get away with not doing it. And here's the real kicker. In my experience, like the finale of this conversation, of this agreement you're going to have with somebody is really to test it and say, okay, so in your own words, tell me what you think we're agreeing to right now. And all you need to do is just listen to what they're saying. And if there's any gaps, just know you haven't made the agreement yet. Your job is to then say, okay, oh, that's really helpful. There's still some, I have a different understanding than you have of the agreement. Let's listen for these differences in understanding and clarify again and clarify again. And in that effort, and then revisit it over and over again. If there's a breakdown in the commitment, if the agreement is somehow not showing up the way the other person thinks they should be experiencing it, there's room to have that conversation with constancy and regularity. These kinds of really, I think it's almost like relational hygiene. Like it's just getting clear and keeping in tune with what is currently true. These are these basic fundamental building blocks that I think people could say, "Oh, but that would be nice to do." And I would say these are critical to do if you're seeking high performance in your organization.
I would say that this applies to cross-functional teams as well.
Yes.
Like the
Anyone.
examples we gave, yep,
Yes,
was more hierarchical,
that's
right?
right.
Where your manager can assign you projects, they can tell you what needs to be done. But I think this type of conversation and entering an agreement and practicing it is especially important when you are trying to for someone to do something, but you don't have power over them, right? Like you can't make them do it.
This works with my teenager who says to me in a text message, "Hey, can you pick me up at 5? Can I count on it?" Like, the second text is the one that actually matters. It's the first one, I'm like, "Yeah, sure." The second one is like, "Can I count?" "Oh, wow. I'm making an agreement here. Like, I'm at stake." She's counting on me. And she might even, like, raise the stakes and say, "I'm not only counting on you, it's gonna impact my social status because 'cause I'll be late to a thing, and that's gonna affect this." And I'm being a little facetious. Although my 18-year-old is pretty astute, she might actually
I was
put
gonna
that
say
in text.
she's a teenager, so I would actually really believe you if that was
And
the conversation.
but it's a great example where she doesn't have power over me, but she can enroll me in an agreement from any position or posture. And I think the cross team example is a perfect one, Orchid. I think that's actually where the rubber hits the road. Because in a hierarchical relationship, you can kind of make the person do the thing, kinda. But when you don't have power, you do have the ability to create an agreement. And it really is a creative act to find a way to have these kinds of conversations and get this conversation going in a way that really constructs something new. It's an asset to the organization.
And I'll add a really tangible example of this. So we have a couple of clients who are going through large rebrands. So the visual identity is going to be different for their company. So that means that, the creative, I think, parameters are a little loose until they have the rebrand in place. And then once they have the rebrand in place, the brand team really wants to have a lot of ownership over it because they've spent so much time and effort and sometimes money on this rebrand. So they want to make sure that everything looks right and none of the old creative or old branding exists. And what happens in this moment is that there's a tension is or friction is created between the brand team and then sometimes the performance or e-commerce or performance creative team. And I think that this is where a conversation happens. And sometimes you need to use visual aids and say, hey, I understand where you're coming from in that you want everything to look consistent. And, now consumers are going to have to shift their mindset into the new branding. You're doing that. I also need performance creative assets.
Mm,
And I know you don't have your brand book finalized yet, but what can we agree to that these will they'll have this color palette, they will have this typography, they will have, the new images. Like, can we agree that this is the bare minimum that we can get to move on? Because we obviously also have to drive business impact for the business in the midst of this rebrand.
yeah. And my guess is, Orchid, in those kinds of moments, there's kind of a temptation to not have those conversations because it's with an or a brand you're trying to impress, you're trying to do good work for them. And you're like, you don't wanna kind of jeopardize anything by having an kind of a tense, attention-filled conversation. But the irony is, your courage and willingness to have these conversations early in the relationship actually increases the likelihood of success, like, exponentially in the long term of the relationship. And I think that's the part where the stakes are so high. Finding it in a sense, this is kind of an exercise in gap hunting. It's like all of these things, we might all intuit, gosh, this should just be normal. Everyone just is clear and all are on the same page that we're all trying to do the same thing in the right way. But that's almost always wrong. It's all unless we're overt to have the conversation and be granular and material about what we mean by success and how we're going to get there. And inevitably, we just kind of wander into dysfunctional relationships and false assumptions. And I thought you were going to do this. And why didn't you show up the way that I thought you were supposed to? Well, they didn't know. There wasn't clarity and it wasn't on the table. And we didn't even figure out how we are going to communicate about it along the way. But when you do, it's almost like setting up an account properly. Like things start working and the agreement actually becomes a structure that does much of the heavy lift because you were willing to have those conversations and get clear before you got started.
I would say that this is incredibly important in a remote culture as well, where you don't have, an office space where you get to watch how people interact, where you overhear how people interact. And so I think a fun example is this idea of a dress code, right? If I say business casual to someone, they have something in mind, I have something else in mind.
Yep.
And so the practice of the agreement is like, okay, do we agree that khaki pants for business casual? Okay, cool. What about a polo shirt? Is that business casual? And one person will be like, I don't think that is. But at like the end of it, you come to a shared view and vision of something
Yes.
that feels right and achievable for both parties.
Yeah.
And I think that that is something I love and I think is applicable up and down the organization, across the organization, with external partners. I mean, and it genuinely, I think it's one of those exercises where in the upfront, it feels a little cumbersome. Like
Yes.
it feels a little awkward to go up to someone and say, I would like to make an agreement with you. Like you
It
kind of
does.
feel dorky doing it.
At least the
But I
first
do think,
at
yes,
least
the first couple of times.
that's right.
You're not going to be a dork forever.
That's right. It's temporary.
And I do think that it gets easier as you go along because you don't have to formally say, let's make an agreement. You automatically start to enter into a conversation where there wasn't clarity and shared understanding at the beginning, but
Mhm.
you're leaving that conversation with clarity and shared understanding.
Yeah. I will say though, I don't disagree with you, especially when you have enough reps, it becomes like second nature. But with an organization where you have new people coming in, and this also can be a cultural asset. If this starts to become normal and you are over to say, I'd like to make an agreement, and that becomes normal and not so normal that it's like a skit on Saturday Night Live and people are making fun of it, but at least normal enough where you've gotten through the awkward stage and you realize like, oh, there's huge benefit to actually doing it this way, especially when someone new comes into your department and they're like, what's an agreement? Well, if this is happening all the time, they're going to get trained in real time and they're going to actually feel a greater sense of clarity, security, understanding. One of the biggest reasons when, we see exit interview data and when people leave, they'll often say like, I'm leaving because I was confused. I didn't feel secure. I didn't know what success was. Nobody was clear with me on a regular basis that I was moving in the right direction. And that's not okay. And ironically, most of what we're talking about, this simple exercise, takes care of a significant portion of those complaints because everyone is clear with real consistency. And you can actually, if an agreement breaks down, you actually have something to talk about. You might even have written it down. Like, this is our agreement. We're clear about it. And I think in many ways when people are working with employees and they go on a, performance improvement plan or, some kind of a means to get better, that's when we start to make the agreement. Well, why not make the agreement on the front end as opposed to when things go sideways? Well, most people don't because they don't see the value yet. But I promise when they are proactive with it, they won't go back because it is such a healthier, more kind of vibrant way to live in the workplace and to do your work because you know where you stand in the relationships that you're navigating.
I want to add one more thing that this helps with, and I think
Yeah.
it's intergenerational
Hmm.
conflicts that arise as
Are you
well.
saying this just because
So,
my silver hair? Am
oh
I
my
the
gosh, no. So there's a TikTok trend where you have someone who's a millennial and someone who's Gen Z. They
uh-huh.
stand on either side of a door so they can't see each other.
Uh-huh.
And you give them prompts and you say, how do you pick up a phone? And the millennial does this, and the Gen Zer goes like this.
Uh,
And they say, okay, well, how do you roll down a car window? And the millennial will go like this, right?
uh-huh.
And then the Gen Z will like press the button.
Yeah.
And so I do think like, again, like as like Gen X, millennials, like we are leaders now and we've been in
Right.
a pre-COVID world of working in professional norms. And we continue to usher in the generation of Gen Zers. Like the reality is that we don't have shared language. And so I could say, hey, send the client an email, please. Like, and I was like, okay, well, in my mind, I know exactly what a professional email to a client looks like and
Yes.
how it's formatted, but the other person might not.
That's
And
right.
so I do think it is like, it's hard for, and I'll be really candid here, like, it's hard for me sometimes because I'll be saying, so I'm like, well, I knew what that was. Like, how come this person doesn't know what it is? Like, that seems so obvious.
Right.
And it really is that, we have the mantle of leadership and responsibility. And it is our responsibility to our employees, our team members, to make sure that we're clear on what the expectations are, what
Mm.
the goals are, and give them consistent, and I don't want to say constant, but it almost is like feedback, right? It just creating a really tight feedback loop on gaining clarity. So, like, what good looks like, what success looks like.
I love that. It's almost like a translator box
Mhm.
to to cross the divide. And there's big divides that are invisible, but they're real and material. And I think you're right. I think generationally we're just not always conscious to those. And if we can just have a process that reveals them, we can do something about it. And our hope, I think, in all of these conversations, like last week and this week, the point of these are to just offer a lens. It's not the lens. We don't think we have, a corner on the market here, but these are how we are navigating and seeing significant returns. Just the frameworks or mental models or ways to think about how are we working with people in the context of projects that are really challenging to get a group of people to run in the same direction in the way that we're all hoping and dreaming. So as we continue to share these lenses or perspectives or frameworks, our hope is that you guys as listeners, if there's things in this that are helpful, would you let us know about it? It'd be super helpful. And also if there's gaps where you're like, gosh, what seems to be missing or are there areas that we could explore together let's make an agreement that you all who are listening would actually communicate back to us and vice versa. And I think if we do, we're going to create a much more valuable time together.
Well, thank you, Dane, as always. I would say see you next week, but we know that's not true. I'm just going to see you after this call. But I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again for having, I think, our conversations. They're philosophical, but they also feel very tangible and applicable. And I just really enjoy this time and space with you. So
You
thank
too,
you.
Orchid. Thank you.